The wind in Dustwind had a language of its own, a mournful whisper that spoke of endings. It was born in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the West Texas plains, and it died against the sun-bleached, splintered wood of the town's few buildings. It carried red dust that settled into the lines on a man's face, coated the tongues of thirsty horses, and painted the world in a perpetual shade of rust and regret. Dustwind wasn't a place people came to. It was a place they were from, or a place they got stuck. So when the woman and two small children appeared at the edge of town, walking from the shimmering heat of the horizon as if conjured from the dust itself, they were an anomaly. The woman's dress was worn but clean, a faded calico that had seen too much sun. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed her face, but it couldn't hide the straightness of her spine or the resolute set of her jaw. She held a small boy's hand, while a slightly older girl with hair the color of spun moonlight walked close to her other side, her eyes wide and fixed on the strange, silent street. They carried little, just a single carpetbag between them, but they moved with a purpose that belied their meager possessions. They didn't stop at the saloon or the general store. The woman led her children past the blacksmith's shop, where the ring of a hammer on anvil fell silent as the smith stared. She navigated the dusty main street as if from memory, her steps sure, until she stopped before a small, neat house with whitewashed walls that were peeling like sunburnt skin. The home of Martha Gable, a widow who had known the woman long ago. She raised a hand and knocked. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the wind, but it was decisive. When the door creaked open, Martha Gable's face, a roadmap of hard years, tightened first with suspicion, then with a disbelief so profound it stole her breath. "Clara?" The name was a gasp, a ghost on her lips. "Clara Miller? It can't be—" "It is, Martha," the woman said, her voice low and steady, though a tremor of exhaustion ran through it. "I'm sorry to impose. We need a place to stay, just for a night or two, until I can find something." Martha's eyes dropped to the children, who huddled closer to their mother's skirts. The girl, with her pale hair and startlingly serious blue eyes. The boy, a smaller echo, clutching a worn wooden horse. They were beautiful, ethereal children, completely out of place in the grit of Dustwind. "They said, the fire," Martha stammered, unable to reconcile the woman before her with the tombstone that bore her name in the churchyard. "The fire took everything else," Clara said, a shadow passing over her features. "It didn't take us." The news moved faster than a prairie fire. It started with Martha Gable's sharp intake of breath, was carried by the blacksmith's disbelieving stare, and caught flame in the general store. Clara Miller is alive. The name, buried for 7 years under rumor and tragedy, was resurrected. But it was the second part of the whisper that truly set the town ablaze. And she has children. Doors opened a crack. Curtains were pulled aside. The women of Dustwind, who measured virtue in church attendance and the cleanliness of their laundry, stared with cold, assessing eyes. A widow's return was a miracle, a tragedy reversed. A widow's return with 2 fatherless children was a scandal. Noah Coulter felt the news before he heard it. He was in the corral behind the livery, his back to the town, mending a leather strap on a saddle. He worked with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who had long ago made peace with solitude. The past 7 years had carved new lines around his eyes and leached the easy laughter from his soul, leaving behind a stillness that people mistook for calm. It wasn't calm, it was emptiness, a space hollowed out by fire and loss. Jed, the livery owner, came shuffling out, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the water trough. "Noah, you ain't gonna believe who just walked into town." Noah didn't look up. "Don't much care for gossip. Jed—" "This ain't gossip. It's a damn ghost story." Jed grunted. "It's Clara Miller." The leather strap slipped from Noah's fingers. The world, which had been a steady rhythm of wind, dust, and the scent of horse sweat, tilted on its axis. He slowly straightened up, his knuckles white where he gripped the fence rail. He turned, and his eyes scanned the length of the main street. And then he saw her. She was standing outside the general store, her back to him, speaking to the owner. Even from a distance, he knew the set of her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head. He had traced the line of her neck with his lips 1,000 times in his memory. She shifted, turning slightly, and for a heart-stopping moment, he saw her profile. It was her, older, thinner, etched with a weariness he didn't recognize. But it was Clara, his Clara, the woman he had loved with a ferocity that had nearly burned him alive, the woman he had watched die. His heart, a dormant, scarred thing in his chest, gave a violent lurch, then seemed to shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. The air grew thin. The dusty street dissolved into a blur of heat and light. And he was no longer standing in the afternoon sun of 1877. He was back in the suffocating blackness of that night 7 years ago. The smell of pine and smoke choked him. The sky was a terrifying, brilliant orange, pulsing with the heartbeat of the fire that was consuming everything they had built. He could hear the roar of it, a hungry beast devouring their small ranch house, their barn, their future. He remembered grabbing her hand, trying to pull her through the inferno. A falling beam, a shower of sparks, the searing heat driving them apart. He had been thrown clear, his arms scorched and useless. He'd scrambled to his feet, screaming her name, trying to get back to the collapsed doorway where he'd last seen her silhouette framed against the flames. But the heat was a solid wall, pushing him back, melting the very air he tried to breathe. The sheriff and other men had dragged him away, fighting and kicking, his throat raw from screaming her name until it was just a voiceless croak. He had failed. He had not been strong enough, not fast enough. He had left her in the fire. They'd found only scorched earth and unrecognizable remains, and they had told him she was gone. Now, a ghost in a calico dress stood in the sunlight, and beside her were 2 children. The girl turned her head, and a shaft of light caught her silvery blonde hair. Noah's breath hitched. It was the exact shade as his mother's. The child looked up at Clara, and her lips formed a single, clear word that the wind carried across the distance like a death knell. Mama. The townsfolk saw it too. They saw the children with no man beside them. They saw Clara, a woman they had mourned as a virtuous bride-to-be, now returned under a cloud of mystery. The whispers changed their tune, hardening from shock into judgment. 7 years was a long time. Where had she been? Who was the father of those children? The conclusion was as swift as it was cruel. She hadn't died in the fire. She had run off with another man, a lover she'd kept hidden. She was a fallen woman, returning with the fruits of her sin. Expecting what? Forgiveness? Welcome? Clara felt their stares like stones against her skin. She saw the women pulling their own children closer as she passed, saw the men look at her with a new kind of interest, a crude speculation that made her stomach turn. She had known it would be like this. She had prepared for it. But knowing and feeling were 2 different things. After a single night on Martha's floor, a night spent listening to the strained silence from the other room, Clara knew she couldn't stay. She thanked Martha with a quiet dignity that offered no explanations and left at dawn. She did not seek charity. Instead, she went to the town clerk, a man who peered at her over his spectacles as if she were a particularly complicated legal document, and inquired about the old Miller cabin at the edge of the woods. It had been abandoned for a decade, a collapsing ruin no one wanted. She bought it for $3. The place was barely more than a shack. The roof sagged, the windows were broken, and dirt and leaves littered the floor where animals had sheltered. It was a picture of hopelessness, but to Clara, it was a fortress. It was hers. The town watched her work. They watched this spectral woman, with her 2 silent children, begin the impossible task of making a home from a wreck. She didn't ask for help. When a farmer, his offer of assistance heavy with pity and suspicion, offered to help her shore up the roof, she politely refused. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson, but the children and I will manage." And they did. She taught the little girl, Abigail, how to mix mud and straw to patch the chinks in the walls. She showed the boy, Samuel, how to carefully remove and clean old nails so they could be used again. She was tireless. They saw her hauling water from the creek, her shoulders straining. They saw her on her knees, scrubbing the grimy floorboards with sand and lye. They heard the sound of a hammer, clumsy at first but growing more confident, echoing from the woods. She taught her children to live on the edges of things, to be frugal and quiet and invisible. She was building a wall around her family, not just of wood and mud, but of sheer, unyielding pride. She would not bow her head. She would not beg. She would survive on her own terms, under the cold, watchful eye of the town that had already condemned her. Sunday in Dustwind arrived with the same unforgiving sun as any other day, but it was marked by the tolling of a single church bell. For Clara, the sound was a summons to a trial. She had spent the better part of Saturday mending her one good dress and scrubbing Abigail and Samuel until their faces shone. She braided her daughter's pale hair with a strip of blue ribbon she had saved, a lone relic of a softer past, giving her children a place in the community. A sense of belonging meant facing the lions in their den. When she walked down the aisle of the small, stuffy church, a hush fell over the congregation. It was not a respectful silence. It was the collective intake of breath before judgment is passed. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the women in their starched bonnets turning to stare, their husbands shifting in the pews. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front, settled her children between her and the wall, and opened the communal hymn book with hands that did not tremble, a feat that cost her every ounce of her will. The Reverend's sermon was on the prodigal son, but his eyes kept finding Clara, and his words about sin and repentance felt less like a parable and more like a personal accusation. She sat through it all, a statue of composure, but inside, a cold dread was taking root. This was not a welcome. It was a warning. Noah stood in the shadows across the street, leaning against the weathered wall of the livery. He had watched her arrive, a solitary ship sailing into a hostile harbor. He couldn't bring himself to go inside, to sit among the pious hypocrites and witness their silent persecution of the woman he had once sworn to protect. So he watched from a distance, as he had for weeks. His life had become a series of stolen glances. He saw her at dawn, hauling 2 heavy buckets of water from the creek, her slender frame straining with the effort. He saw her coaxing a small garden from the hard, unforgiving soil behind her cabin. He saw the flicker of a lamp in her window late at night and wondered what ghosts kept her company in the dark. One afternoon, he saw her sitting on her doorstep, showing Samuel how to carve a piece of wood into a bird. She had pushed a stray strand of hair from her face and smiled at the boy, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her weary features. The sight was a physical blow, a punch to his gut that left him breathless. That was the Clara he remembered, the one whose laughter could make wildflowers seem dull. Seeing that glimpse of her, followed by the immediate return of the cautious, haunted woman she had become, was a torture he willingly endured every day. He was a moth drawn to a flame he could no longer touch, a ghost haunting the edges of a life he had lost. The breaking point came on a hot, listless afternoon. Abigail and Samuel, finally venturing from the protective circle of their cabin, were trying to sail a small boat made of bark in the shallow part of the creek. A group of older town children, led by the blacksmith's son, cornered them. Their taunts were the cruel, parroted words of their parents. "Where's your PA?" the blacksmith's boy sneered. "You ain't got one." "My mama says your mama is a bad woman," a girl with tight braids added. "That's why she ran away." Abigail, ever the serious one, stood protectively in front of her younger brother. "We have a mother," she said, her small voice trembling. "That's all we need." Everyone needs a PA, the boy jeered, shoving Samuel so he stumbled and fell into the muddy water. The bark boat was crushed under his boot. You're just strays. Nobody's children. Clara arrived at that moment, a basket of laundry on her hip. She saw Samuel crying, covered in mud, and Abigail standing defiant, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. The other children scattered like crows, laughing. Clara said nothing. She simply gathered her children, wiped their faces, and led them home. She didn't scold or shout, but later that evening, hidden in the deepening twilight behind her cabin where she thought no one could see, she finally broke. She leaned against the rough-hewn wall, buried her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook with silent, hopeless sobs. It wasn't the town's judgment or the back-breaking labor that had undone her. It was the pain she had brought upon her children. Noah saw it all. He had been riding in from the plains and had tethered his horse in the trees, intending to leave a small sack of flour on her doorstep without being seen. But he stopped, frozen by the sound of her weeping. It was the sound he had imagined 1,000 times in the years she was gone. A sound of grief so profound it seemed to tear the air. It was a pain he felt in his own bones. He turned his horse and rode back to town, a cold, dangerous fury simmering in his veins. In the saloon, he found Caleb Smith, the blacksmith, holding court with a few other men, a smug look on his face. "Heard my boy finally put those strange little birds in their place today," Smith was saying with a chuckle. "Someone has to teach them they ain't welcome." Something inside Noah snapped. He walked straight to the man. "You'll teach your boy to keep his mouth shut about Clara and her children," Noah said, his voice dangerously low. Smith, a larger man, laughed. "Or what, Coulter? You gonna defend that runaway's honor?" Noah didn't answer with words. He threw a punch, a hard, clean shot that sent the blacksmith stumbling back over a chair. The saloon erupted. It wasn't a fight Noah could win with skill. It was fueled by 7 years of repressed grief and rage. He was reckless, taking as many blows as he landed, until the sheriff hauled him off, his lips split and his knuckles raw. "What in God's name has gotten into you, Noah?" Sheriff Thompson demanded, pushing him against the saloon wall. "Starting brawls over a woman of her reputation." "Don't you talk about her," Noah growled, the fight still burning in his eyes. The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "Go home, Noah. Sleep it off. I won't put you in a cell, but you stay away from Smith, and you stay away from her. She's nothing but trouble." But Noah couldn't stay away. Not anymore. He splashed water on his face at the trough, the cold sting doing little to cool the fire inside him. He walked through the gathering dusk, past the watchful eyes of the town, and straight to her cabin in the woods. She was outside, sitting on the steps, a shotgun resting across her lap. She had heard the commotion from town, and her face was a pale, impassive mask. She stood as he approached, her posture rigid. "What do you want, Noah?" she asked, her voice flat. He stopped a few feet from her, the cut on his lip throbbing. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the deep-seated fear she tried so hard to hide. He had come here to rage, to demand answers, to ask the 1,000 questions that had haunted his nights. But looking at her, all the anger evaporated, leaving only a vast, aching sorrow. "Why, Clara?" His voice was hoarse. "Why did you let me think you were dead?" Her composure cracked for a second. A flicker of pain crossed her face before she extinguished it. It was better that way. "Better?" The word was incredulous, torn from him. "I buried you. I mourned you. I spent 7 years as a dead man walking because of you. How was that better?" She looked away from him, toward the dark silhouettes of her children moving inside the lamplit cabin. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, carried on the evening breeze. "I tried so you wouldn't have to bear this burden." He took a step closer, his own hurt momentarily forgotten in the face of her strange, sacrificial words. "What burden? The children? The scandal?" He didn't understand. All he knew was the gaping wound her absence had left in his life. "And he said, his voice breaking with the weight of 7 years of solitude. "I waited for you to be alive for 7 years. She finally looked at him then. Truly looked at him. Her cold facade crumbled, and in her eyes, he saw it all. The shared memories of a love that had been as wild and vast as the plains. The agony of the fire, the terror of her hidden years, the fierce, protective love for her children, and beneath it all, an emotion so powerful it arced between them in the fading light, a current of longing and regret that had never cooled, never died. It was a love that had survived the flames, a love that had been buried alive, and was now, terrifyingly, breathing again. The unspoken words lingered in the air between them, more substantial than the dust motes dancing in the last rays of sunlight. In the silence that followed Noah's pained admission, 7 years of ghosts rose up. For Noah, they were ghosts of memory and regret. For Clara, they were the ghosts of lived experience, of pain and fear she had never shared with a soul. Her mind was thrown back, against her will, to a time before the fire, a time of stolen kisses behind the barn and whispered promises under a blanket of stars. They had been engaged for a month, their small ranch house nearly finished, built by Noah's own hands. It was a time of fierce, untamed hope. And it was then, in the heat of that hopeful summer, that she had realized she was carrying his child. She had planned to tell him on the night of the fire. She'd baked a pie, the last thing she ever made in that small kitchen, and waited for him to come in from the fields, the words a joyful secret bubbling on her tongue. But he never came in. The fire came first. She remembered the splintering crash of the burning roof beam, the searing pain in her shoulder and head as it struck her a glancing blow. She'd been thrown into the pantry, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. When consciousness returned, it was to a world of smoke and roaring flame. She had tried to get out, screaming his name, but the main room was an impassable wall of fire. She saw him for a moment, a silhouette against the inferno on the other side, and then he was gone. He hadn't come back. The thought had been a shard of ice in her heart, more painful than any burn. Asterisk. He left me. She had finally found a weak spot in the back wall, clawing her way out into the night just as the rest of the structure collapsed in a final, terrible sigh of embers and smoke. Wounded, disoriented, and choking on grief, she had stumbled away into the wilderness. She walked for what felt like days, driven by a primal need to escape the scene of her life's destruction and the crushing weight of her perceived abandonment. She was found near death by a Comanche woman named Prairie Sky, a healer who lived alone in the foothills. The woman had tended to Clara's burns and the gash on her head, had fed her broth and strange-tasting herbs, and had never asked a single question. It was in the quiet solitude of Prairie Sky's wickiup that Clara had come to terms with the new, terrifying shape of her life. She was alone. She was carrying Noah's child, and a shadow from her past was hunting her. Before she had met Noah, her father had been killed in a land dispute by a ruthless gunman named Silas Kane. Kane had a cruel obsession and had made it clear that he considered everything that belonged to her father, including his daughter, to be his property. Clara had fled her family's homestead to escape him, eventually finding safety and love in Dustwind, with the fire erasing her existence. She knew Kane would think she was dead, but to reappear, to be known as Clara Miller again, would be to put a target on her own back, and now, on the back of her unborn child. And so, Clara Miller died in the fire. In her place was born a nameless, haunted woman who followed Prairie Sky deeper into the mountains, in a hidden valley, in a small hut built of mud and pine. She gave birth not to one child, but to 2. Twins, a girl with hair like moonbeams and a boy with his father's serious eyes. The shock and joy of it cemented her resolve. She named them Abigail and Samuel and raised them in secret, teaching them the names of the trees and the tracks of the animals. She lived a phantom life, sustained by a fierce, all-consuming love for them. But as they grew, so did their questions. They needed more than the mountains could offer. They needed books, other children, a future. They needed a life. And giving them one meant Clara Miller had to be resurrected, no matter the cost. That history was a wall between her and Noah. He could not see it, but she felt its cold, unyielding stone every time he looked at her. His confession, that he had waited for her, had chipped away at that wall. It was the first crack in the foundation of the story she had told herself for 7 years. In the days that followed, an unspoken truce formed between them. Noah started to ride out to her cabin, not to talk, but to work. He didn't ask permission. He simply appeared one morning and began repairing the sagging roof of the small lean-to she used as a stable. He worked with a silent, focused intensity, the rhythmic strike of his hammer a strange kind of conversation. Clara would leave a tin cup of water on a fence post for him. The next day, he replaced the broken gate. She left him a piece of freshly baked cornbread, wrapped in a cloth. He mended the corral fence. She patched a tear in his work shirt, leaving it folded neatly where he'd find it. They were orbiting each other like two planets held in a delicate, invisible gravity, close enough to feel the pull, too afraid to collide. The town watched, and the whispers grew louder. But Clara and Noah remained locked in their silent dance of tentative reconnection. The collision came with the rain. A late autumn storm blew in from the north, a sudden violent tempest that turned the sky to bruised purple and lashed the plains with sheets of silver water. Clara had been caught out, walking back from the creek, and the deluge hit with the force of a physical blow. The path turned to slick, red mud, drenched and shivering. She was still a mile from her own cabin when the first crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating Noah's small, sturdy house just ahead. It was the house he had lived in alone since the fire, a place she had never seen. Seeking shelter there felt like a surrender, but the wind was tearing at her, and the thought of her children waiting made her push open his gate. He opened the door before she could knock, as if he had been watching for her. He pulled her inside without a word, his expression a mixture of concern and something deeper, something unreadable. The warmth of the room was a shock. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the simple wooden furniture. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. He handed her a rough wool blanket. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice husky. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her teeth chattering. "The children." "They'll be fine," he assured her. "Your cabin is sturdy, and they have each other. They'll think you were smart enough to find shelter." They stood in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. It was a strange and potent intimacy, being enclosed in this small, warm space while the world was being torn apart. The firelight played across his face, accentuating the lines the years had carved there, the sorrow in his eyes. She saw the man he had become, a man forged in a loss she had caused. "I'm sorry, Noah," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "For everything." He finally looked at her, and the carefully constructed walls between them crumbled to dust. "Don't," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't be sorry, just be here." He moved toward her then, slowly, as if crossing a great distance. He reached out and gently touched a strand of wet hair clinging to her cheek. His touch was hesitant, but it sent a jolt of heat through her that had nothing to do with the fire. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the unspoken longing of 7 wasted years surged to the surface. In his eyes, she saw the reflection of her own aching soul. She saw the boy he'd been and the broken man he was now. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of grief and desperation, a raw, hungry expression of everything they had lost. It was the fury of the fire and the coldness of the years apart. It was 7 years of unspoken words, of phantom touches, of a love that had refused to die. One kiss bled into another, each one deeper, more frantic. The blanket slipped from her shoulders. His hands tangled in her damp hair, pulling her closer. as if he feared she might vanish into thin air. This wasn't about forgiveness or understanding. It was a primal, desperate need to feel something other than the hollow ache of loneliness. They moved from the hearth to the shadows of the room, two people clinging to each other in the heart of a storm, seeking a refuge that could not last. They made love with a sorrowful urgency, a frantic attempt to reclaim a past that was gone forever, their bodies remembering a language their minds had tried to forget. Long after the storm had passed and the rain had softened to a gentle patter on the roof, they lay in the darkness. No words were spoken. The act had not healed them. It had only opened the wounds wider. The chasm of secrets and misunderstandings still lay between them, now deeper and more treacherous than ever. Before the first light of dawn, Clara slipped from his bed. She dressed in silence, her movements stiff and strange in the unfamiliar room. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see his face. She fled his house, not back to her own cabin, but to the cold, damp air of the lean-to stable next to it. She sank onto a pile of hay, the scent of earth and animals surrounding her, and finally let the tears come. They were not tears of release, but of profound, shattering shame. Noah stood from his bed and went to the window. Watching her go, he saw her bypass her own door and disappear into the stable. He pulled on his trousers and walked to his front door, opening it to the cold, pre-dawn air. He could feel her presence across the clearing, could feel her sorrow as if it were his own. He wanted to go to her, to comfort her, to say something, but what was there to say? He stood at his threshold, a sentinel of regret, his bare feet cold on the wooden planks. He didn't dare cross the distance between them. He didn't dare knock, the morning after the storm broke clear and cold, washing the world clean. But for Clara and Noah, the air was thick with a new kind of shame. Silence, which had once been a space for their tentative reconnection, was now an accusation. They avoided each other's eyes, the memory of their desperate, sorrowful passion a fresh wound between them. But in a town as small as Dustwind, secrets have a short lifespan. Someone had seen Clara leaving Noah's house in the pre-dawn light. Someone else had seen the light in his window burn all night. That was all it took. The whispers started at the water pump and gained venom by the time they reached the mercantile. The story twisted into a new, uglier shape. It was no longer a tale of a long-lost widow, but of a woman of loose morals, leaving her children all alone to spend the night with that man. The words, sharp and poisoned, flew through the town. She has no shame. They saw her not as a woman driven to shelter from a storm, but as a wanton creature indulging her desires. The town's earlier judgment, which had been a cold, simmering suspicion, now boiled over into open condemnation. Clara felt the change immediately. The stares were no longer just curious, they were contemptuous. Women who had offered a stiff nod before now turned their backs on her completely. When she went to the general store, the owner served her in stony silence, his wife watching from the back room with undisguised disgust. The words reached her, as they were meant to. A snippet of conversation overheard as she passed the saloon. A deliberate comment spoken just loud enough for her to hear as she haggled for feed. Abandoned her children again, just like she abandoned her fiancé in that fire. Each word was a knife in her heart. She had spent 7 years building a fortress of solitude and fierce maternal love around Abigail and Samuel. She had endured hardship and loneliness, all to protect them. Now, in a single night of weakness, she had given the town the very weapon they needed to tear her children's world apart. The shame she felt was a physical weight, a constant sickness in the pit of her stomach. She watched her children playing, their innocent faces oblivious to the new stain on their mother's name, and the guilt was suffocating. Noah felt the town's scorn just as keenly, but it ignited anger in him, not shame. He had lived with ghosts for 7 years. The opinions of his neighbors meant little to him. All that mattered was the woman in the cabin in the woods. He saw the new pallor on her face, the way she flinched when someone passed too close, the dark circles of torment under her eyes. He couldn't bear it. He found her by the creek, washing clothes on a flat stone, her knuckles red and raw from the lye soap. He stood there for a long moment, watching the relentless, punishing rhythm of her work. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we have to stop this." She didn't look up. "Stop what?" "This, the whispers, the looks. Let me tell them the truth." She finally paused, her hands still in the cold water. "What truth? Noah? The truth that I'm a fool who brought disgrace on my own children?" "No," he insisted, stepping closer. "The truth that you're my intended, that we were always meant to be. We'll get the preacher. We'll stand up before all of them. Let me make you my wife. Let me give the children my name. No one will dare say a word against them then." She looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with a despair so deep it startled him. "Your name?" she said, her voice trembling with a bitter irony. "And what happens when they look at Abigail and Samuel, who are nearly 7 years old, and they do the arithmetic? It won't protect them. Noah, it will only confirm the story. It will make them the children of sin for the rest of their lives. I will not have my children shamed in the house of God. I will not have your name dragged through the mud with mine." "I don't care about my name," he said, his frustration mounting. "I care about you." "And I care about them," she countered, her voice hardening with resolve as she stood up. "More than my own happiness, more than yours. I won't do it. I won't make their lives harder than they already are." She picked up her basket of wet laundry, the weight of it making her stagger slightly. "Stay away from me, Noah. It's the only way." He watched her walk away, her back ramrod straight, and felt a profound and chilling hopelessness. He had offered her the only protection he had, his name, his love, and she had thrown it back in his face for reasons he couldn't fully argue against. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, not toward the familiar plains, but toward the scorched patch of land where their home had once stood. The fields around it were dead and fallow, the earth still black and scarred. A few skeletal, blackened trees pointed accusingly at the sky. He rode through the desolation, the dead, dry grass crunching under his horse's hooves. The landscape was a perfect mirror of his heart, a barren wasteland where nothing could grow, haunted by the ghost of a dead fire and a love that seemed utterly, hopelessly doomed. A few days later, a new rider came to Dustwind. He was a tall man with cold, watchful eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. He wore a brand new badge pinned to his vest, gleaming in the harsh sunlight. His name was Silas Kane, and he had been appointed the new sheriff by the territorial governor. The news meant little to most of the townsfolk, but when Clara heard the name, all the blood drained from her face. She was at the mercantile, picking up thread. When she saw him ride down the main street, she recognized him instantly. The years had hardened his features, but the predatory stillness, the way he surveyed the town as if it were his personal property, was unmistakable. It was the man who had murdered her father, the man she had run from all those years ago, the reason she had stayed hidden. A primal, paralyzing fear seized her. It was a terror she hadn't felt since she was a girl, and it was 1,000 times worse now because it was not just for herself. He hadn't come to Dustwind by accident. He had found her. She dropped her purchases, turned, and fled, running blindly back toward the woods, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her sanctuary, her small, hard-won cabin, suddenly felt like a trap. The walls she had so carefully built were nothing against a man who wore the law as a weapon. He would find a way to take her children. He would destroy her life. And this time, there would be nowhere left to run. That night, she made her decision. As Abigail and Samuel slept soundly in their small bed, she moved about the cabin with a frantic, silent terror. She packed their few belongings into the old carpet bag, a change of clothes for each of them, the small wooden bird Samuel loved, Abigail's blue ribbon. She took the last of her money, the small bag of dried meat, and a canteen of water. To run again. To disappear back into the wilderness. It was the only way. She would take them and vanish before the sun rose, before Cain even knew for certain she was the woman he'd been hunting. She was just lifting the sleeping form of her son into her arms when a shadow fell across the doorway. Noah stood there, his face grim in the moonlight. He had seen the light in her window, had felt a deep unease, and had come to check on her. He took in the scene at a glance, the packed bag, the fear in her eyes, the sleeping child in her arms. "What are you doing, Clara?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet.
"I have to leave,"
she whispered, clutching Samuel tighter.
"We have to go, now."
"Because of the whispers? Because of what I asked you?"
"No."
She shook her head, her eyes wide with a fear he didn't understand.
"It's something else. Someone is here. I can't stay."
"Then I'm coming with you," he said, taking a step inside.
"No!"
The word was a strangled cry.
"You can't. That's the one thing you cannot do."
He saw the finality in her eyes, the same desperate flight he had seen the day she arrived. She was doing it again. She was going to disappear and leave him with nothing but a ghost for the second time. The quiet sorrow in his heart hardened into a raw, jagged desperation. He blocked the doorway, his body a barricade against her escape. "If you leave again," he said, his voice low and shaking with the force of his emotion, "don't expect me to be alive to wait a second time." The threat, so unlike him, hung in the air between them. Her face crumpled, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks.
"I just want to keep you safe,"
she choked out, her voice thick with anguish. The dam of his own control broke. The hopelessness, the fury, the fierce, possessive love he had for her erupted from his chest in a raw shout that filled the small cabin. "And I want to keep you!" His shout echoed in the small, cramped space, a raw sound of possession and desperation that startled the sleeping children. Abigail stirred, murmuring a name in her sleep, and Clara instinctively reached out to soothe her, her hand trembling. The raw power of his declaration had stripped away her last defense. He wasn't offering pity or charity. He was claiming a right forged in a past she had tried to bury.
"Keep me?"
she whispered back, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a deep, shuddering weariness.
"Noah,
you don't know what you're asking. You don't know who you would be keeping me from." And so, in the pale moonlight, with the ghosts of their past and the threat of their future pressing in on all sides, she finally told him everything. The words came in a torrent, a 7-year dam of secrets breaking apart. She told him about her father, a good man who had been cheated out of his land by a ruthless man named Silas Cain. She told him how, after her father had fought back, Cain had shot him down in cold blood, an act the law had called a fair fight.
"He was obsessed,"
Clara whispered, her eyes dark with remembered terror. "He saw my father's land, our ranch, everything, as his prize. And he saw me as part of it. He told me that a man takes what he wants in this world, and he wanted me." She explained how she had fled, leaving everything behind to escape Cain's suffocating shadow, how she had thought she'd found a new life, a safe life, with Noah.
"The fire,"
she explained, had been a tragic, twisted kind of salvation. It allowed her to disappear completely. "When I saw you leave me in the flames," she confessed, the old wound still tender, I thought you were abandoning me, and I knew Cain would eventually come looking. So I ran to protect the baby I was carrying. Our baby." The full weight of it finally settled on Noah. The children, her flight, her 7 years of silence. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a desperate, terrified act of protection. The man who had just ridden into town wearing a sheriff's badge wasn't just a threat. He was the monster from her past, come to claim his prize, now with the full power of the law behind him. the hollow space of grief in his chest filled with a white-hot, protective rage. He looked from Clara's terrified face to the sleeping forms of the children, his children, and a new, unshakable purpose settled in his soul. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "He won't touch you," he said, his voice a low, iron promise. "Or the children. I don't care what the town thinks. I don't care what badge he wears. This is our home. You are not running again." For the first time in 7 years, Noah felt truly alive, the emptiness inside him replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. He would stand between Clara and the world, a shield forged of love and fury. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. The next day, Silas Kane, flanked by 2 thuggish deputies he'd brought with him, rode out to the cabin. He didn't dismount, but sat high on his black horse, looking down at Clara and Noah, who stood together in front of the small porch. Abigail and Samuel peeked out from behind Clara's skirts, their eyes wide with fear. Kane's lips twisted into a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Clara Miller, it took me a long time to find you. I have to admit, rising from the dead is an impressive trick."
"My name is Clara Gable now,"
she said, her voice shaking but defiant. Noah's hand rested on the small of her back, a silent, steadying pressure. "Is it?" Kane's gaze swept over her, lingered on the children, and then settled on Noah with dismissive contempt. "The law has a different name for it, fraudulent identity. I also have a report here that you've been concealing 2 undocumented children, without a father to claim them. They're wards of the territory. The law is very clear on such matters." Every word was a carefully chosen threat, a legalistic trap designed to suffocate them. He was twisting her survival into a crime, her children into contraband. "They are my children," Noah said, stepping forward slightly. "And this is my intended wife. You have no business here, Kane." Kane laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're intended. A little late for that. Coulter, 7 years too late, unless you're willing to swear before a judge that you fathered these children before you were wed. A crime of its own in this territory. Then they have no legal father. And this woman," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing purr as he looked at Clara, "is a fugitive from the law. I'm giving you a warning. I can make this easy, or I can make this hard. You send the woman to my office to make a full confession, and I might be inclined to be lenient about the children." The unspoken offer was hideous and clear. "Give me Clara, and I might let the children be." "Get off my land," Noah growled, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt at his hip. "Careful, Coulter," Kane warned, his own hand resting on the butt of his gun. "This is an official visit. You interfere with the sheriff in the performance of his duties. And I can arrest you too. I'll be back tomorrow for her answer." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his deputies following like vultures. The threat of his return hung over the cabin like a shroud. They spent the day in a state of suspended terror. Clara held her children close, reading to them in a strained, tight voice, while Noah sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp and angry. The town, which had heard of the confrontation, offered no support. They saw it as the inevitable consequence of Clara's scandalous life, a reckoning she had brought upon herself. The next morning, Kane returned, as promised, but this time, he brought a warrant and a set of iron manacles. He strode onto the property as if he owned it, his deputies flanking him. "Time's up, Clara," he announced. "You're under arrest for identity fraud and concealment of wards of the territory." Noah moved to stand in front of her. "You'll have to go through me." Kane smiled coldly. "I'd be happy to. It's called resisting arrest." He nodded to his deputies, who drew their pistols. Clara grabbed Noah's arm, her eyes pleading. "No, Noah, don't! Think of the children!" She knew Kane wanted this. He wanted Noah to draw on him, to give him a legal excuse to kill him. Her words stopped him. He looked at her, then at his children, who were now clinging to her legs, crying. He was trapped. To fight was to die and leave them unprotected. To do nothing was to watch the woman he loved be taken by his enemy. It was a checkmate of the cruelest kind. Helpless rage burned in his chest as he watched one of the deputies grab Clara's arms and force them behind her back. The cold, metallic click of the manacles locking around her wrists was the loudest sound in the world.
Mama!
Abigail shrieked, her small face contorted with terror. Samuel began to sob, a heart-wrenching, broken sound. Clara turned her head, her face a mask of agony.
It's all right, my darlings, she said, her voice strained. Mama will be back. Be good for Noah.
They dragged her away. Noah stood frozen, a statue of impotent fury, as the children ran to him, grabbing his legs, their small bodies shaking with sobs. He watched until the riders disappeared, leaving him alone in the dust with two crying, terrified children and a silence that screamed with failure. Later that day, after leaving the children with a reluctant but sympathetic Martha Gable, Noah went to the jail. He found Clara in a small, dark cell at the back of the sheriff's office. The air was cold and smelled of damp stone and despair. She sat on a narrow cot, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had composed herself, building a wall of ice around her heart. She would not let Cain see her break. She looked up as he approached the bars.
You shouldn't be here, Noah, she said, her voice flat. He'll see it as a provocation. I don't care what he sees,
he said, his voice rough. He reached through the bars, his hand open.
Clara.
She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his. Her skin was ice cold. She had resolved not to cry. Crying was a luxury, a weakness she could not afford. But as his warm, calloused fingers closed around hers, a single tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. It fell onto the back of his hand, a drop of pure, silent anguish. And in that moment, watching her solitary tear fall in the darkness of that cell, his decision was made. He held her hand for a moment longer, then released it. He turned and walked out of the jail without another word, his face set like stone. He had tried to reason. He had tried to live within the boundaries of the town's judgment. He had been stopped by the shield of a corrupt law. But Silas Cain had forgotten where he was. This was the West, and when the law became a weapon for evil men, there was only one law left that mattered, the law of the gun. He would not challenge Sheriff Cain. He would challenge the man, and they would settle it, once and for all, under the open sky. The challenge was delivered not with a thrown gauntlet, but with a cold, simple message carried by Jed from the livery. Noah Coulter will meet you at sunrise, on the old Miller plot. There was no ambiguity. It was not a request for a parley. It was a summons to a final judgment. Silas Cain, arrogant in his power and confident in his skill, accepted with a sneer. A formal duel was outside the law, but out here, some things superseded the statutes written on paper. A man's honor, a woman's life. These were still matters to be settled by the gun. The location was a wound on the earth, a place of ghosts. The sun rose over the eastern plains, casting long, skeletal shadows from the few charred timbers that still stood. This was where Clara and Noah's house had been, where their future had turned to ash. The ground was hard-packed and barren, covered in a fine layer of red dust that rose in pink clouds with every footstep. It was a natural arena, a stage set for a tragedy. Noah arrived first, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. He was calm, but it was the unnatural calm of a man who had stripped himself of everything but a single, driving purpose. He was no longer thinking of the past or the future. There was only the here and now, the weight of the Colt peacemaker at his hip, and the face of the man who had stolen his life. Cain rode up moments later, flanked by his two deputies, who positioned themselves at a distance like vultures waiting for a kill. Cain dismounted, his movements loose and confident. He was a showman, a predator who savored the fear of his prey. He wore his twin revolvers low on his hips, their handles worn smooth from use.
"Come to die for her, Coulter,"
Kane called out, his voice full of mocking bravado.
"She wasn't worth it. I would have grown tired of her in a year."
Noah didn't answer. He didn't rise to the bait. He simply walked to the center of the clearing, his eyes locked on Kane's, his face an unreadable mask of grim determination. This wasn't about words. It was about an act of cleansing. He would wipe this man's shadow from Clara's life, or he would die trying. Back in town, Clara paced the confines of her cell like a caged wolf. The morning light filtering through the high, barred window told her the sun was up. A gnawing dread, cold and sharp, twisted in her gut. She didn't know the details, but she knew Noah. She knew his quiet honor and the depths of his love. He would not let her languish here while Kane held all the power. He would confront him. The thought was a certainty, as cold and hard as the stone floor beneath her bare feet. Her escape was not a feat of cleverness, but of desperate, animal cunning. The old deputy Kane had left to guard the jail was half-deaf and spent most of his time dozing in a chair by the stove. Clara had watched him for hours, noting the rusty hinge on the cell door, the way the lock was worn. Using the thin metal stay from her corset, a piece she had painstakingly worked loose during the night, she began to probe the lock. Her hands were clumsy, her heart hammering with a frantic rhythm. For what felt like an eternity, the metal scraped uselessly. Then, just as she was about to give up in despair, she felt a faint click. The bolt slid back. She held her breath, waiting. The deputy snored on. Slipping out of the cell, she crept across the office, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards. She grabbed the first weapon she saw, an old, heavy star revolver left carelessly on the desk. She didn't know if it was loaded. She didn't know how to use it, but it was heavy and real, and she clutched it like a talisman as she slipped out the back door and ran. She ran toward the rising sun, toward the pillar of dust in the distance that marked the old Miller plot, a terrible certainty pulling her forward. The duel began without ceremony. There was no countdown, no signal. There was only a moment of charged silence. And then the world exploded into motion. Kane was faster. His hand was a blur, his gun clearing the holster in a single, fluid motion. But Noah had anticipated it. He wasn't trying to be faster. He was trying to be smarter. He dove to the side as Kane's first shot ripped through the air where he had been standing, throwing himself behind the blackened remains of an old water trough. Wood splintered as Kane fired again and again, pinning Noah down.
"You can't hide forever, Coulter!"
he roared, advancing slowly, a confident smirk on his face. Noah knew a straight gunfight was a losing proposition. Kane was a professional killer. Noah was a cowboy. He fired back, not aiming to hit, but to force Kane to take cover. As Kane ducked behind the remains of a stone chimney, Noah scrambled to a new position, using the scarred landscape, a terrain he knew with an intimacy born of love and grief, to his advantage. The fight devolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse. It was not a noble contest of skill. Kane was a brawler who used any means necessary. As Noah moved between patches of cover, he felt a sharp, searing pain in his calf. He looked down to see his trouser leg darkening with blood, a bear trap, its metal jaws hidden just beneath the dust. Kane must have planted it before he arrived. Noah gritted his teeth, tearing his leg free with a surge of adrenaline, the pain nearly making him black out. He was wounded, and Kane knew it. The sheriff emerged from cover, walking forward calmly, firing with measured precision. A bullet grazed Noah's shoulder, spinning him around. Another tore through the fleshy part of his arm. He was bleeding from 3 places, his movements becoming sluggish. He managed to fire back, his own shot wild, before stumbling to one knee. He was losing. He was going to die here, on the ashes of his past. It was this scene that greeted Clara as she crested the final rise, breathless and exhausted, her lungs burning. She saw Noah, bloodied and kneeling in the dust. She saw Silas Cain, a dark, implacable figure, walking toward him, raising his pistol for the final, killing shot. A sound, a primitive scream of pure negation, was torn from her throat. "No!" Both men turned, startled by her sudden appearance. Cain's face broke into a cruel, triumphant grin. "Look what we have here. You've come just in time to watch him die." That moment of distraction was all Noah needed. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he lunged forward, not with his gun, but with his body, tackling Cain around the waist. The two men crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Cain's pistol flew from his hand, but Cain was a snake. As they wrestled in the dust, he drew a long, wicked-looking knife from his boot. He drove it viciously into Noah's side. Noah cried out, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain, and his body went limp. He collapsed onto the ground, his eyes glazing over. Clara saw it all happen in a kind of slow, horrifying clarity. She saw the knife. She saw Noah fall. She saw Cain rise to his feet, panting, a look of murderous satisfaction on his face. He started to walk toward Noah's fallen form, intending to finish the job. Something broke inside Clara. The fear, the grief, the years of running. It all burned away, replaced by a singular, cold focus. She raised the heavy revolver she was still clutching, her hands shaking so badly she had to use both to steady it. The world narrowed to the space between the end of the barrel and the black heart of the man who had destroyed her life. Cain saw her then and laughed. "Are you going to shoot me, girl? You don't have the stomach for it." Her vision was blurred with tears. Her arms ached from the weight of the gun. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her backwards so she stumbled and fell. The shot went wide, but it made Cain flinch and turn toward her, his face a mask of rage. "You'll pay for that!" He started for her, but on the ground, Noah, barely conscious, his life bleeding out into the red dust, performed his last act of love. He reached for his own fallen pistol, his fingers closing around the grip. He didn't have the strength to lift it, but he cocked the hammer. Clara, scrambling in the dirt, saw Noah's movement. She saw Cain advancing on her. She raised the star revolver again, the terror and adrenaline giving her a strange, unnatural calm. She aimed for the center of his chest and pulled the trigger. This time, the bullet struck true. Silas Cain stopped in his tracks. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, then back at Clara. He took one more step, then crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror over. The silence that followed was absolute. The deputies, seeing their leader fall, wasted no time. They mounted their horses and fled, disappearing over the horizon. Clara was alone with the dead and the dying. She scrambled to Noah's side, dropping the gun as if it were on fire. He was so pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. Blood was everywhere, soaking his shirt, pooling in the dust beneath him. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling freely now, washing clean streaks through the grime on his face. The setting sun bathed the entire scene in a bloody, beautiful light, a beer scent and tragic tableau of love and sacrifice. "Noah," she sobbed, rocking him gently. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, and he tried to focus on her face. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. He lifted a blood-slicked hand and touched her cheek. "I won't live," he whispered, his voice a faint, rasping breath, "if I'm without you." Noah's return to the world was not a sudden awakening, but a slow, arduous crawl from a deep, dark well of pain. He didn't die in the red dust of their ruined past. Jed, the livery owner, his conscience finally outweighing his fear of gossip, had ridden out after seeing Clara run from the jail. He found them clinging to each other under the blood-red sunset, and with a grim resolve, brought them back to town. The doctor, a weary man who had seen too much of the violence the West could inflict, offered little hope. "The knife wound is deep, and it's festered," he'd said, after pulling the blade from Noah's side and stitching him up on his own kitchen table. "He's lost too much blood. Now it's a matter of fever and God's will." God's will, it turned out, was a stubborn woman named Clara. She moved Noah from the doctor's house to his own small, solitary home, and there she began her vigil. The house that had once been the scene of their passionate, shame-filled reunion now became a sanctuary of healing, a fortress against both death and the town's unyielding judgment. For weeks, Noah was a ghost in his own bed, lost in the gray twilight of delirium. He thrashed against memories of the fire, calling out her name in a hoarse, broken whisper. He fought Silas Kane 100 times in his fevered dreams, and through it all, Clara was there. She was a constant, tireless presence. She bathed his burning forehead with cool water. She forced spoonfuls of thin broth between his cracked lips. She changed the bloody, weeping bandages on his wounds, her stomach churning but her hands steady. She did not sleep, subsisting on coffee and sheer, unbending will. She had lost him to the fire once. She would not lose him to the fever now. The town watched, their condemnation now mixed with a morbid fascination. They saw her, a wraith-like figure, hauling water at dawn and dusk. They saw the lamp in Noah's window burning through the long, cold nights. Their whispers continued, but the tune began to change. The initial, harsh judgment of a fallen woman was now complicated by the undeniable fact of her devotion. She was nursing the man who had, in their eyes, rid them of a corrupt and dangerous sheriff. They were caught between their rigid morality and their grudging respect. So they did nothing. They offered no help, but they did not interfere. They simply watched, waiting to see if he would live or die. Clara felt their silent observation as a constant pressure, but she ignored it. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of that sick room. Her children, staying with a still reluctant Martha Gable, were a constant ache in her heart. She missed their laughter, the feel of their small hands in hers, but they were safe. Noah was not, and so she stayed, a sentinel guarding the flickering flame of his life. The turning point came not with a dramatic declaration, but with a simple bowl of soup. One afternoon, as a cold wind whipped through the town, Clara saw a figure walking slowly and deliberately up the path to Noah's house. It was Mrs. Gable, the old widow. Her face a mask of grim resolve, carried a steaming bowl covered with a cloth napkin. She didn't knock. She just opened the door and walked into the kitchen, placing the soup on the table. "He needs real broth, not just water," she said, her voice gruff, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. She stood there for a moment, a silent battle playing out on her wrinkled features. Then she looked at Clara, and her gaze was not unkind. "That girl," she said, more to herself than to Clara. "She never did anything wrong. She just lived for love." And then she turned and left. It was the first crack in the wall of ice. Mrs. Gable's walk up that path was a public act. Others had seen. The next day, a loaf of fresh bread appeared on the porch. The day after that, a pail of fresh milk. Small, anonymous offerings. They were not acts of friendship. Not yet, but they were a retreat from condemnation. They were a quiet admission that perhaps they had misjudged the woman in the lonely house. Slowly, painfully, Noah began to heal. The fever broke one night, leaving him weak and thin, but blessedly clear-headed. He woke to find Clara asleep in a chair by his bed, her face pale and exhausted in the lamplight. He watched her for a long time, the fierce, protective love he felt for her a physical ache in his chest. She had saved him. She had pulled him back from the brink with nothing but the strength of her own heart. As his strength returned, Clara brought the children to see him. They entered the room timidly, their eyes wide as they looked at the pale, bandaged man in the bed. This was the stranger their mother had wept for, fought for, and nearly died for. They stood by the bed, a respectful distance away. Noah, his voice still weak, smiled at them. "Hello, Abigail. Hello, Samuel." Samuel, the shyer of the two, hid behind his sister, but Abigail, with her mother's courage and a child's directness, looked him straight in the eye.
"Are you our father?"
she asked, the question simple, yet holding the weight of their entire world. The question hung in the quiet room. Clara held her breath. Noah looked at their two small, serious faces, at Abigail's moonbeam hair and Samuel's cautious, dark eyes, so like his own. The emotion that rose in him was so powerful it threatened to break him. It was a wave of love and regret and a fierce, boundless pride. His own eyes filled with tears, which he didn't bother to hide. His voice was thick and choked when he finally answered. "Yes," he said, his gaze meeting Abigail's. "And so much more." He was their past, their future, their protector, their home. In that moment, in that quiet sick room, the four of them became a family, bound not by law or a preacher's words, but by a trial of fire and blood and unwavering love. That evening, after the children were asleep in a small cot Clara had set up in the corner, a fragile peace settled over the house. A full moon shone through the window, bathing the room in a soft, silver light. Noah was strong enough to sit up, propped against a mound of pillows. Clara sat in the chair beside him, mending one of Samuel's shirts. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the unspoken things between them no longer a chasm of secrets, but a quiet, shared history. Finally, Clara put down her sewing. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. The fear of running, of being hunted, was gone, but a new, more vulnerable fear had taken its place.
"If you want me to stay,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you just have to say so." It was an offering. She was giving him back the choice, the power. She would not assume his love, not after all the pain she had caused him. She would not chain him with obligation. Noah reached out, his hand still weak, and took hers. He pulled her gently toward him, until she was sitting on the edge of the bed. He used his good arm to draw her into a careful embrace, mindful of his healing wounds. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of her, the scent of home. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, broken plea against her ear. "I'm begging you, don't leave again." She pulled back to look at him, her own tears tracking paths of moonlight on her cheeks. He wasn't asking, he was begging. The proud, solitary man had been stripped of all his defenses, leaving only his desperate, profound need for her. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not like their kiss in the storm, born of desperation and grief. This kiss was gentle, a slow, deep, and deliberate promise. It was a kiss of homecoming, of a future finally within their grasp, the fire in their eyes. As they looked at each other in the moonlight, was no longer the destructive flame of the past, but the warm, steady, and enduring glow of a hearth fire, a beacon to guide them home. A year passes in the West not in the turning of pages, but in the turning of seasons. A year is a harsh winter that tests your resolve, a hopeful spring that greens the plains, a long, hot summer of relentless work, and a golden autumn of harvest. For Noah, Clara, and the children, it was a year of building. They lived together on the old Miller plot, the land that had been the site of both their greatest joy and their deepest tragedy. They never stood before the preacher, in a town that had once judged them so harshly. A legal document seemed a hollow and meaningless thing. Their vows had not been spoken in a church, but whispered in a dark jail cell, sworn in a fevered sick room. and sealed in a crucible of blood and gunpowder. Their union was a living, breathing thing, forged in a fire far hotter than any preacher's sermon. They were a family, not by the laws of men, but by the undeniable law of the heart. The first structure Noah built was not a house, but a barn. He worked from sunup to sundown, his body, though scarred, growing strong and lean again. The clean, sharp scent of newly cut pine replaced the lingering smell of ash. He was not just rebuilding a structure, he was reclaiming a dream. He was raising a testament of resilience from the scorched earth, a symbol that what was lost could be found, what was broken could be mended. While Noah built with wood and nail, Clara built with words and kindness. She turned the front room of their small, temporary cabin into a schoolhouse. Her first pupils were her own children, Abigail and Samuel. But soon, others came. The 3 orphan children who lived in the back of the church, the shy son of a dirt-poor farmer, the 2 wild daughters of the town drunkard. Clara taught them their letters and their numbers, but she also taught them things the world had tried to make them forget, that they were worthy, that their voices mattered, that a difficult past did not have to dictate a bitter future. She, who had been an outcast, became a champion for the outcasts, and in doing so, she began to gently mend the frayed social fabric of the town. Life was simple, measured by the rhythm of their work. They ate what they grew in their garden and what Noah could hunt on the plains. They had little in the way of coin, but they were rich in a way that money could not measure. They had the quiet peace of the evenings, sitting on their porch, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. They had the shared warmth of their bed at night, a safe harbor from the ghosts of the past. The land was still wild, the wind still lonely, but it was no longer a place of desolation. It was a place of hope. The town, which had once been a wall of silent judgment, began to open up, one person at a time. The change hadn't come overnight, but through a slow accumulation of small observations. They saw Noah, a man they had pitied as a broken recluse, now working with a purpose, a quiet joy in his eyes. They saw the orphan children, once sullen and withdrawn, now laughing and running to Clara's schoolhouse each morning. The wall of prejudice, built of rumor and fear, could not stand against the undeniable evidence of goodness. Clara, wanting to contribute more, turned her one great domestic skill into a small enterprise. Using a sack of fine flour Noah had traded a mended saddle for, she began to bake. At first, it was just pies and bread for her own family, but the warm, sweet scent of cinnamon and yeast drifted on the wind. A fragrant invitation. Mrs. Gable was her first customer, buying a loaf of bread with a gruff nod. Soon, others followed, coming to her cabin with a few pennies, making excuses about being too busy to bake themselves. They came for the bread but stayed for a moment of quiet conversation. They saw not a scarlet woman, but a mother, a teacher, a woman of quiet strength and gentle grace. Her small kitchen became an unlikely crossroads, and the act of breaking her bread became a sacrament of acceptance. The final scene of their healing was painted not in a single, dramatic moment, but in the soft, golden light of an ordinary evening, a year to the day after the duel. The new house was finished, a modest but sturdy home standing proudly where the old one had burned. Its windows glowed with the warm light of a happy home. Noah was out in the newly fenced pasture, a wide open space that was now green and lush. He was on his horse, a tall, strong figure silhouetted against the setting sun, but he was not alone. In front of him, sharing the saddle, was Samuel, his small hands holding tightly to the pommel. Beside them, on a gentle mare of her own, was Abigail, her pale hair a silver halo in the twilight. Her laughter, clear and untroubled, pealed across the plains as she urged her horse into a slow canter. Noah's own deep, rumbling laugh answered hers. Clara stood on the porch of their new home, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She watched them, her family, her husband, her children. She saw the easy way Noah rested a hand on Samuel's shoulder, the proud smile on his face as he watched Abigail ride. She saw the freedom in her children, the unburdened joy of a life safe and secure. A gentle breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back, a soft, contented smile on her face. The woman who had been hunted, who had lived in the shadows, was now standing in the light, the undisputed mistress of her own home, the queen of her own small, beautiful world. The man who had lost everything now had it all. The woman who had been abandoned was now the anchor of a family. They were no longer lonely souls defined by their scars, but a single unit, whole and healed. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the vast western sky in shades of rose and violet, Noah and the children turned their horses toward home. In the town of Dustwind, no one whispered anymore. The silence was not one of judgment, but of peace. The only sound that carried on the evening air was the echo of laughter, rolling free and joyous across the great, wide plains. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts with us.